And so this is where you find these incredible truths, is in that age of the first temple, where they still believed in the mother, the father, and their son. They still believed in the relationship that makes God.
Welcome to In Her Image, a podcast where we seek and celebrate our Mother God through scripture, scholarship, and everyday life. I'm your host, Meg Britmanick, and today I have with me Jared Lambert, which I'm so excited. Jared and I have been good friends for the last year and a half, and Jared is just so knowledgeable, really loves the scriptures, loves the languages of the scriptures, and you are just in for a treat today because your mind is about to be blown by all of the incredible things that Jared is going to share with us. He has also recently put together a course that I highly recommend people sign up for, because if they really want to know and understand how to see Heavenly Mother in Scripture and understand the story of the divine family, Jared has all of the pieces to put that puzzle together. So, Jared, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited.
Yeah. This is going to be so amazing. So today we said we wanted to chat kind of about why we don't need to be scared about exploring the divine feminine, because she is a part of our doctrine and she is throughout the scriptures. Right, Jared?
Yeah, that's right. So it's funny because what I am is I'm a historical linguist, and what that means is I study the linguistics of these sacred texts diachronically. And what we mean by that is you go back to the earliest notion of even an individual word, or you could just go back to the earliest notion of a theme or a setting. But in my case, as a linguist, I hone in on individual words. I focus on their earliest notions, and then I study how that word evolves over time and how it changes and morphs into different meanings and contexts over time, and why those changes are important. When you study it diachronically, when you study your scriptures diachronically, you realize there's so much there that you're missing, right? And this is why we've been asked by our prophet to start studying more, right? In the new student manual, President Nelson wrote in there that we have to study individual meanings in the context of their time to be able to understand them, right? And then we now have all these new sources, right? Study the NRSV, study the new English version of the Bible, or whatever you prefer. Look at different versions so that we can see a better meaning, because there is so much there. And I think for most people, when you do that, when you finally go back and you see the kind of torrid history that we see in the Hebrew Bible, you see, one, it's very typically a sexist narrative. You have this concerted effort to remove, the mother from the text, to remove women in the priesthood from the text, and that's to be expected. I mean, it's not weird for us to understand how the sexism that has happened in history, that is still happening today, right? This is a normal theme, but it is so interesting to see how it's been removed and how that narrative actually shapes this story. And so what I tend to do in these classes is, one, I start every class with a lesson in cognitive psychology, because for me, I have been studying in higher education for over 20 years. I have 7 degrees. I speak 8 languages, and I am just going to go to school forever. I'm less of a scholar and more of like that special student who doesn't ever leave school. I am that one who there's too many questions that I have there, and there's too much knowledge to be had, that I find myself jumping programs, and I have a very multidisciplinary approach to my studies because I need to see all angles, right? And so in my education, a big breakthrough for me was taking a huge time off of my regular studies, where I felt like I was stuck, where I wasn't making these connections right, because I did have this very traditional interpretation of ancient biblical history, because we've been told that is the way it is for so long now. There was never a reason to second guess it. But pieces weren't adding up. I mean, linguistically, you have these hints everywhere where, certain things are written in the feminine, and you have, Miriam called a prophetess, and Huldah as a prophetess. And what are these roles of prophetesses? Why do they receive these titles like the men? And there clearly there's a deeper story happening in this text. Why are none of the pieces fitting? So when I went and took these like cognitive psychology classes, I realized that a lot of the things that I consider facts, or that I consider to be this knowledge that I have, was actually more of like, in Islam they have these things called hadiths, and it's this like secondhand information. It's these like truths that are not directly from the source, but are generally believed. So I realized that I had a lot of hadiths, and I did not have a lot of primary sources, primary facts that I knew for sure myself. And so I started analyzing my what I have come to refer to as a truth tower, right? How I built up this knowledge of religion that I had. I started removing individual bricks that I realized were just kind of hadiths. It's not that they weren't untrue, it's just that they weren't based in absolute fact. They're kind of rumor mill truths. And when you learn the actual truths behind it, it's so much more beautiful, right? When you get into that context, it's astounding. And honestly, we shouldn't be scared, right? If you truly are a believer of this religion, if you truly do believe God is truth, then all truth should be acceptable, right? My favorite quote from Joseph, right? Accept truth wherever it may come. That should be our mantra, and we should be studying all truth that we can get our hands on, because as Latter-day Saints, we have a hard time, especially like this is a hard year for Latter-day Saints. We're studying the Old Testament. Oh my gosh, the Old Testament is so, it's like everyone kind of reverts it. You go to Sunday school and everyone's like, let's talk about ministry, and let's talk about anything else except for what we're supposed to be talking about, because we hate that a lot of, and it's not just us as Latter-day Saints, it's a lot of people just hate this Old Testament text because it is really hard to understand. It's hard to piece together. It's hard to put the narrative cleanly in sync. But in all honesty, it's because you don't see, it's really hard to be like this God of the Old Testament that's telling us to like kill babies and like women are the worst and like all these other
Yeah.
things is the same God of the New Testament. How is that? Like, I don't see the parallel here. This is insane.
Yeah.
And that's the issue. We have a hard time seeing our religion and our God in the text. But you need to have faith, right? You need to know that, like, one, this is extremely old. It's not one book, right? And we tend to flatten the Bible into one book, right? We tend to flatten it as if it's like written by the hand of God, in the sense that like God sat down and penned out this narration, and it's not. It's interpretations after reinterpretations after reinterpretations for thousands and thousands of years. And so there's a big mess in there, but we should be excited about unraveling that, right? We should know that as we start doing it, we will find our God. The best example that I give is the concept of God himself in the Old Testament, which is the word Elohim, right? Because that word Elohim is a palimpsest, is what we call it in linguistics. It just means it's this older concept of God, because the word Elohim is not it's not the word for this, for how or I shouldn't say we, I should say how the regular Christian world perceives God today, right? This kind of this white man with a beard who's sitting on a throne, by himself. This is not the word for Elohim. This is not who God is to them in those scriptures. If they wanted to say that, they would just say El. And then if they wanted to say like he's majestic, so use a plural majesty for that, well, that would be Elam. That wouldn't be Elohim. Elohim is something completely different, because the plural of El is Elam. So if you were to try to be, use the majestic plural, that would be Elam. So then this word Elohim is in fact something that is very familiar to Latter-day Saints, right? Elohim is a reference to the Godhead, a relationship that makes God, right? And so we know this from a lot of factors. You have Psalms 82 that talks about the Elohim as a council of gods, with the Elohim that sits at the top of the council. And so I always point out to everyone that's such an important scripture in Psalms 82, because it shows you that, yes, we have this idea of the lesser deities that are the children of God. But when you separate God away from them, it's still in the plural. It's still maintained as Elohim, and as in two gods. And how do we know it's two? Like, how do we, because then people get confused and go, okay, is it one father and one mother? Is it one father and multiple mothers? Is this a polygamous situation? No, we know 100% for sure that this is one father and one mother. How do we know that? Well, you just look at how they're worshiping at the time, right? One of the greatest archaeological discoveries we have at the time is the Kuntilataj route, right? And the site at Khrbet el Kom, in which they show you that they worship the male god and his Asherah, right? And they use a possessive suffix to show that they're not one blob god. It's not like a man and a woman kind of formed into a singular god. No, the possessive suffix in that phrase shows that they are relationally joined together as one, but individual in nature. And that is so important to see that this is what God is. And the linguistics all throughout the text emphasize this, right? Genesis 1:27. Let us go down and make man, ha'adama, humanity, in our image, male and female. And it tells you what the image of God is. That it is in fact that male and that female singular, right? And so we know that's the Godhead of Elohim. But then you also have the children of God in that word, right? Which is because this word Elohim is what's known as etymological layering. It's this, we see it all throughout the text. You see it throughout all the traditions of the ancient Near Eastern world, where you have like Baal and El together united as one God, which is Baal El, right? Or you have Amun, the god in Egypt, you have Amun and Ra, and they are merged together into Amun Ra, right, as one God. But just relationally, they are individual gods, right? So we see this etymological layering. This is exactly what Elohim is. But Elohim's interesting because it is the notion of a male and female God united, yes, but it's also all their children. And so, who are these children? Well, we can prove this kind of manipulation of the text because we have found the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1928, which is our oldest rendition of the Hebrew Bible. In Psalms 82, we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls a notion of the Bene Elohim, or literally this notion of like, yes, the children, but it's more of like the crianças, the ones that are the offspring of them that grow into to what they are, to then the phrase is to bear the burden of their parents, right? Which means to become just like them. And that is in that original script. But then what do we have in our version prior to the Dead Sea Scrolls? We have them identified as simply the sons of Israel. Why? Because they don't want you to connect this idea that you are in fact the actual children of loving heavenly parents and you will one day become as the gods. But even though we have all that incredible evidence, this isn't like huge news that's being reported to the world. Nobody knows these things. Like, this is hidden. I just did an interview on Faith Matters of maybe a couple months ago, even. And from that, I had all these people. I had this guy repost my video and go, "This is the most insane notion I've ever heard." I looked everywhere and I couldn't find a single bit of scholarship on this notion of a heavenly father and a heavenly mother. And this has been settled in scholarship for over 30 to 50 years now. We have had like William Devers or Margaret Barker or James Kugel or Mark Smith, right? These are the biggest names in the historical studies of the time, and yet no one is reading them. And the only people that would care to read them should be the Mormons. Like, it should be us as Latter-day Saints who are shouting at the rooftops these incredible discoveries, because that is our church. That's where we finally see the God we know. We know that God is a loving Heavenly Father and a loving Heavenly Mother united together. This is what we teach in our temples. This is what you go through in your temple ordinances, where you now become as God by being sealed and bound together as one. And it's there for all of scholarship for the last 30 years, so crystal clear for us. And yet these truths are being erased time and again. And there's so much more there. Like, it is all throughout the text. So as we go through it, I mean, it doesn't matter. Like, even, this week we're studying Jacob. and you have this narration of Jacob becoming Israel, and nobody is connecting the dots, right, in the Christian world. That this is a moment of, we call this the study of onomastics, right, where you study the proper names of the Hebrew Bible, not just the Hebrew Bible, it's all throughout the New Testament as well. It's in the Book of Mormon as well. This is just how they wrote. So these are actual names of the people more as they are what's called in linguistic as motivational semantic layering, right? Their names are telling you a theme that is pivotal to the story that is going to happen. So the name of Jacob, which is heel grabber or treacherous heart, right, shows you the story of this one who is constant. And what's beautiful about, sorry, and I'm all over the place because that's just the way I am. But the what's beautiful about the Jacob story is this is not a written narrative. It never was. The Hebrew Bible was always an oral tradition only. It was actually illegal to write it down, right? You weren't allowed to, because they knew as soon as you wrote this down, it would flatten that narrative and you would lose so much of that truth, right? So it was maintained in this conceptual tone to be able to teach these beautiful connections. And so when you have this narration of Jacob where he's the Yaakov, right, is what his name is. Orally, they are playing off of all of these different narrations of Yaakov, which is like he is the heel grabber, Algev, right? And then all throughout the text, it talks about how he's constantly grasping. He is grasping after the heel. He is grasping after a blessing from God. He is grasping. And so it shows how he is treacherous, how he's trying so hard to get everything that he wants, and it just doesn't do anything for him. He is miserable. And then you have this moment in the narration where he finally meets God. And when he meets God, God finally does give him blessing after a huge struggle between the two. And he gets the blessing of a new name. And that new name is not something that he just gets. Immediately, the very next chapter goes back to calling him the grasper, Jacob, the treacherous heart, Jacob. And little by little, you see the text start shifting Jacob to Israel, Israel to Jacob, Jacob to Israel, back and forth, back and forth. It's not until he is together with his spouse and he has created his family and he is giving his children the blessing of the father to his children, passing on the mantle, that you finally now get Father Israel. And only from that point on is he Father Israel. There's this huge lesson behind the text that should be so clear for Latter-day Saints, right? We are the only people in the world who get new names in their religion. We are the only ones who receive this incredible blessing. And yet it's right there for you to be able to see why and how it works. But we don't dig deep enough, right? Because this stuff has kind of been erased. These lessons have been slowly removed. And that's true for the mother, that's true for women in the priesthood in all its different forms. So it's so interesting to kind of dive into that text and really discover what it's talking about.
I love this idea of it becoming like a metaphor for our own life when you look at it that way, where he's struggling to live up to the calling that God has given him to become Israel, but he's, bouncing back and forth between that. And then eventually, what really gets him to the point where he is able to own that name is that tender care of like caring for another so completely that
Yeah,
you're wanting to bless them and their life. And that is the fulfillment of becoming like God, is
yeah,
putting our priorities in the way that we actually prioritize others over ourselves. And the story of Jacob, at the beginning, it is the story of kind of selfishness. Like he just wants it for himself. He wants all these blessings, he wants all these things. And so he's trying to get it from God and trying to force God to give that to him. But when he realizes that it's not about himself, but it's about his posterity, then, all the blessings come.
absolutely. And it doesn't end there. Like we could literally go through every single story and see quite literally. So what I do as a diachronic linguist is I show where things are written in what time and then how it changes over that time, right? So you can go to any narrative, right? What I'm doing right now with my class is we just went over Moses's narrative, right? And Moses is so interesting because first of all, the first prophet in that narrative is not Moses. The first prophet identified is Miriam. Miriam is the first prophet called from God there. Miriam has this beautiful arc in the narrative in which she fulfills the role of the prophetess all throughout that entire narrative, in which she does the Song of the Prophets, which is a huge deal. Only the prophet was allowed to do that. But she is the one that leads the children in the Song of the Prophets. There is this incredible notion where after Miriam is identified as the prophet, you see this heartbreaking narrative of how the people forget her. Right, they follow her as this prophetess all throughout the narrative. She's leading them with Moses throughout the desert. They get to the promised land, and then they turn their backs on her. They forget her. Right, there's this very bizarre and frankly, linguistically, it's shown to be twisted in a lot of different ways, but because it's just well manicured language. So whenever you see that, you know there's something funky going on. But it's this narrative where she questions the prophet with Aaron, and Aaron doesn't get punished, but Miriam does. Miriam gets, she's banished, she's removed. And then you don't hear about Miriam ever again. Everyone forgets about her, and then she dies in the wilderness alone. But what I love is the continuation of that narration is she dies, and then what happens? The living waters of the well in all of Jerusalem then dry up with her death. Because why? There's this clear message in that text. If you forget the role of women, if you cast them to the side and you do not honor their priesthood and you do not honor them, then that living water that they provide you, the very source of your life, is going to be removed. You will lose it all. And so it's so shocking to me that these are the narrations, these are the stories behind the text. If you would just open your eyes and study it contextually, there are so many good warnings and lessons for us there. In that same story, you have the notion of Moses, right, going up on the mountain and speaking to God. And what I think is so funny, and I think your viewers will be able to follow this pretty well. You guys, I think, talk about this in depth, so I could probably skip a lot of the history in that. But the symbol of the mother was always the tree, right? But it's not any tree, right? She is the tree of light, or rather, the word for wisdom in Proto-Hebrew is knowledge, yada, meaning experiential knowledge, because there's many types of knowledge, right? There's like the learned knowledge, but then there's also experiential knowledge, which is yada. And so the word for wisdom in Proto-Hebrew is not just a simplified word of wisdom. No, it is a phrase, the knowledge or yada, experiential knowledge of good and evil. And so when we talk about the tree of knowledge of good and evil, we are literally talking about the tree of wisdom. And so this is the mother being kind of this reverse anthropomorphizing of the mother's role in the garden, right? And then we see her carried through the scriptures in that symbol. There are different stages of her all throughout scripture. So in this narration of Moses, where we see this strange manipulation of the text, we see where he goes up onto the mountain searching for God, trying to find answers. And what does he encounter? Well, we have translated this as a burning bush, right? This bush where the fire does not consume it. Well, that's not what the language says. The word there for bush is senna. Senna is the bramble tree. It is not a bush. It is the tree of the desert. And in fact, there is great symbolism behind that. If you have another 3 hours, we can go over the bramble tree and the thorn tree, how it used to be a thriving, living, amazing, beautiful tree that then is now in the desert and is dried up, forgotten, and lost. And so there's incredible symbolism behind that. But he goes to the mountaintop and he sees through this bramble tree, the senna, the thorn tree, right, that is lit aflame. So it is a tree of light that is not being consumed by that light. And through that, he hears the voice of Yahweh, right? And so we need to realize that, yes, this is in fact this coded language. These are all idioms, right? These are all metaphors for what cannot be said anymore, right? You could so easily speak of the role of the mother in the age of the first temple, but now in these later reformed texts, all you can do is hint. All you can do is just tip your hat to these notions. And so then you get this notion of Moses speaking to Yahweh through the mother, right? And through her role. And it's all there linguistically, right? Linguistically, it is perfect. And it's not to say like we have this narration that we pass around traditionally that, well, clearly the mother is bad because prophets condemned her. right? And we don't actually ask why or ask what's the reason behind that, or should we be also condemning the mother? Latter-day Saints should push back against this extreme. Well, this she was revealed in our modern dispensation. Like, we should be questioning this more than anyone else. But I think the greatest example of this is Isaiah chapter 50, verse 1, which is funny because it's not the full text. Isaiah 51 picks up in the middle of a revelation given to Isaiah, and we are missing the first half of that revelation. It's where he is asking God a question, and we're not told what that question is, but it's really clear what it is once you start reading verse 1. And so you run into this notion of him asking, where is the mother? Why are we not worshiping her? What happened to her? So even though we don't have that question there, we know that's what it's about linguistically, because we pick up in the middle of the answer. And so the answer that's given in verse 1 is, where is the bill of your mother's divorcement, who I have put away? I mean, God is literally saying, I didn't divorce your mom, guys. Like, I am not the reason that she is gone. And then he says, and where is the creditor to whom I have sold you? Right? I'm not the one that abandoned you. And us as parents, we're not the ones that turned our backs on you. And then it says, no, it's for your transgressions that your mother is put away, and that you have sold yourselves, right? You have caused this to happen through your own transgressions. It's such a beautiful scripture because it helps us see very, very clearly none of these prophets are actually condemning the Asherah herself, and all of the scriptures that do talk about the condemnation of the mother as the Asherah are only talking about it after the age of the second temple, in which people have lost the notion of the mother, so they are worshiping her in different ways, right? They're bringing the traditions of the Egyptian obelisk into the Asherahs, which is like they would have orgies and sacrifice children to the fertility goddess, right? And of course, this is pagan. Of course, this is wrong. But you have to understand, in the age of the first temple, it's not like this is a small period of time. The age of the first temple, in which they were worshiping monolatrously, the mother and the father together with their son Yahweh, that's the majority of the prophets in the text. Right? Everyone from Adam and Eve all the way until Isaiah are worshiping in the age of the first temple. Every single prophet is doing that, right? Moses at Mount Sinai is worshiping her. The temple of Shechem, Abraham is worshiping her. Again and again, she's being worshipped by these prophets. I always point out to people, you can't condemn the mother and have her removed from the temple unless she was at the temple to begin with. Like, you don't command her to be removed out of the temple unless she's there. So we need to be asking these better questions. We need to be seeing this pattern of what is happening there. We need to realize that, like, no, the more realistic contextual understanding is, yes, there is a real role for the mother. Yes, there is a real role for women and the priestesses that exist in the temple. And yes, we know that because it has been restored to us today in our modern dispensation. But even if you're not LDS, you have to ask yourself, why? Why is Elohim written that way? Why is the mother being removed from the temple if she was never there to begin with? Why are there these women weavers, is what they're called, right? These priestesses who weave the narrative of life together. And where do they do this? It's told in Exodus 23. These weavers stand at the entrance to the Holy of Holies, and they weave together the narrative of life. They are the ones that help people go through the veil to then see what is behind the veil, right? They are the priestesses guiding the people through. I have a book coming out really, really soon that talks about our modern evolution of our own temple. And I show in that book conclusively that in Joseph's version of the temple, he had women as the ones who would pull you through the veil. And he also had women be the ones who weaved the initial veil itself and would weave the veils that the women wear, which we could talk about that as well. That history is incredible. And he was restoring this role of the weavers, is what I would argue would be a really excellent thesis to this linguistic argument of the text. But what we know for sure is that, yes, the women were the one who were pulling the men through the veil. But then we get this meeting that happens on after Joseph's death, in which, yes, Joseph was restoring the women in all their form. right? We know that he told Eliza that she is a modern day prophetess, right? Eliza R. Snow receives the title of prophetess in our modern dispensation. Most likely Emma as well received that, though we have no direct script saying that she did, but she served the role like very, very purposefully as the prophetess in our modern dispensation, as she was the kind of check and balance to the men. The Relief Society was being organized as a balancing system in our modern dispensation. The women were given the entire purse of the church. They were the ones that were going to decide. They had the final say of, oh, you want to do this project? Well, you have to pass it through the Relief Society for approval, right? This was that counter role. Because you should be asking when you're reading the scriptures, what is the role of Huldah as the prophetess, right? When the king finds the scroll of Torah and can't read it, right? Because again, this is an oral tradition. It's not written down, but what they do have written down when they say you can't read it, they have these mnemonic systems, right? Where you would have these characters, these pictograph characters that you couldn't read unless you knew the narrative itself. And the only person who had the knowledge to be able to read these scriptures, which was the temple script, right? The stuff that was for the Holy of Holies, the stuff that was for the Holy Room. He doesn't bring it to the prophet Jeremiah at the time. No, Jeremiah can't read that. Who is the one who could do it? Well, the weavers, the priestesses, the ones who are actually the ones weaving together the narrative of life. So he brings it to Huldah to then have Huldah explain what's going on. And the horrible irony in that, and that does breaks your heart, is that he's bringing it to Huldah because he's trying to dismantle the role of women, the role of the priestesses, the prophetesses in the church. And so he wants to know what it is that they are doing inside of that temple from the source. And so that just breaks your heart to see that process happen. But then what I love, because even though that is heartbreaking, what I love so much is we wouldn't know any of this at all if it wasn't for the fact that as King Josiah is making these reformations, the only ones that are left that are the scribes, that are the ones that are putting these narrations together, are the weavers. And as much as they're trying to replace them with men, they are doing their best to solidify this narrative. And so there are all these breadcrumbs. There is this linguistic rebellion that is happening, not just from the women, but even, the prophet Jeremiah. You have a million examples of him rebelling against the reformations of King Josiah, where King Josiah is telling them in Second Kings that we are now going to, because when you start a new covenant, you would cut all covenants, right? So this was the process of creating a covenant with God. So the prophet or King Josiah uses the phrase, we are cutting a new covenant with God, in which we are now removing the women, we're removing the goddess, our heavenly mother. And this is now the new covenant of the one true God, Yahweh. Well, Jeremiah is told to repeat this, but how does Jeremiah repeat it? He doesn't use the Hebrew word for cutting a new covenant. He uses the Hebrew word for cutting, as in cutting it off, destroying it, removing it. So, yes, Jeremiah makes the announcement, but he says, we are destroying the covenant of God, he says, we are cutting the covenant of our forefathers, meaning we are cutting off the covenant of our forefathers. So you see these linguistic rebellions, and it is so beautiful to see it carried all throughout the text. By even later, by in 530 BCE, hundreds of years later, even Isaiah emphasizing this rebellion of being able to see the mother in that text. So yeah, it's a beautiful story. I mean, listen, if we could just read it in the context that it is in, it would be as Latter-day Saints, it would be our favorite scripture to read. It would be our favorite. Why? Because it tells us we are now completing the restoration. Even though it's as slow as this is going, we are the ones completing the restoration of what they lost. And so it is so beautiful to see that, like, full circle narrative of how they lost it, how the women are removed, how the mother is forgotten, and then how it is being restored in our modern dispensation.
It's
That's
pretty
beautiful.
amazing. It is, truly. But why is it so hard for people to see that narrative?
It is. I think it is really hard. And so, I'm giving these classes, I'm trying to show people how all we can use these tools, right? Because I think it's amazing the church is giving us, the okay, the thumbs up to start diving into different versions of the scriptures. But even that's not going to help us too much in getting the contextual history. So I teach my classes to use sources like BibleHub.com, completely free. It's going to pull in an interlinear version of the Bible so you can see the Hebrew, you can see the Greek, you can see these older notions. But what's nice is, as linguists, we use other tools, right? We use things like the Halet, which is the ancient Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, which gives you an even clearer understanding of what these words meant in their context. We use things like, sorry, and before we go off the Halet, the problem is like the Halet's behind an institutional wall. Like, unless you're a linguist like me and you're connected to an institution, you're not going to be able to access the Halet. But the reason I show everyone like Bible Hub is because they give you a summation of what the Hallet is doing, and it's for free, right? You can go to the lexicon on Bible Hub and you can scroll to the very bottom, and they do the summation of what the Hallet is teaching at the time. So there's really no reason we shouldn't be diving in. Like, anyone can sink their teeth into this, and anyone could be able to find that. And so that's really what I'm trying to do is give people the text to be able to decipher things. Because the problem is it's been erased so well. It's not like Jared Lambert, who studied 20 years in higher education, has all the answers. I mean, I'm not even a Hebrew scholar. I'm a Persian scholar. I study the Persian influence on the Hebrew text of the Bible, because it was Cyrus the Great who liberates them from Babylon. And it was under Cyrus the Great, the Persian emperor, under the Achaemenid dynasty, right? Empire, that they then morphed together this written version of the text. And so because of that huge Persian influence, there are so many truths that had been lost from that influence. But there's also incredible truths that were gained. I mean, this is just how it works, right? Because, we can talk about a few of the things that were lost, but some of the things they gained, I mean, for the first, until they met the Persians, they had no concept of heaven or hell, right? We as Latter-day Saints don't believe in heaven and hell. And why? Well, because in this earlier concept, the Persians come in with this notion of heaven and hell. Well, how did the Hebrew prophets then take that? They then get the revelation of that, no, after you die, yes, you go to a state, what they would call Sheol. And for the longest time, for over 1,000 years, they believed that there was no resurrection, right? This is the true church of God, mind you. You're like, this is a big deal. Why are the prophets not getting revelation about resurrection? Isn't that kind of a critical part of this plan of salvation? But no, for the first 1,000 years, the prophets would only preach about in the afterlife a Sheol, which was kind of how heaven and hell worked for the Persians. It was this notion of, you either, when you die, you're just here on the earth in your spiritual form, and you would wander, and you would either wander in a happy state because you knew you were part of God, or you wandered around completely distraught because you had no idea what was going on, and so you were stuck. So this is their only revelation of the afterlife. Pretty dismal for 1,000 years. Like, that required faith. You think we need faith today? My goodness, that's rough. So then the Persians come in, and when you have the Persian influence, they finally start praying about this idea, because the Persians have this notion of a resurrection, of being restored to God. As soon as they start praying about that, they don't just kind of steal the Persian kind of Zoroastrian notion. No, they end up getting their own revelation, which is where Daniel, it says in 2:12, we shall rise again and see God again. And now they get this revelation of resurrection. And so, yes, we gain some really cool truths when we meet the Persians, but we also lost some really important things too. Prior to the Persian influence, we had the Torah, which today we interpret as the law of God. But the word for law now is, under that Persian influence, is data, which is very much what you imagine laws to be today for us, which is like rules, regulations, delineated, blah, 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 lawyerly junk that you see, the pharisaical stuff that you hate, right? And that's what we know it as. Well, prior to that Persian influence, it was the Torah, as in the relationship. It was not these delineated worlds. It was describing the relationship. And so it would simply describe that relationship between God, right? And that's where we then get this shift of, all of a sudden, our father that is God, or our mother that is God, or or the son that is Yahweh. And all of a sudden it now becomes this very emperor style, the throne of God. The earth is his footstool. He rests his feet on it. We are just the lowly peasants of God's world. This is the Persian influence, right? That kind of mucks that up. But more so, this is where we lose so many incredible truths that just blow your mind with scriptures, right? It's not the Garden of Eden, right? The garden is a Persian word for paradisia, which is a mistranslation and misunderstanding of the Persian paradisia. The Persian paradisia literally is the word for the temple. Why? Because their temples were garden places. They're in the desert. And so the place in which God dwells is a lush green garden. And so it should have been translated as the Temple of Eden. But they did it as garden because of that Persian word paradisia, which is brought into the Bible as the paradise of God. And so they made it this green, lush location. But that is a temple. That is like, what is it? What's the definition of a temple? You walk and talk and learn with God, a place separated from the world that no others can go to, right? So these truths get lost with that Persian influence. And so that's why I study that text as a specifically focusing on that Persian influence, because there are these incredible truths that have been lost to us in the Hebrew tradition, that we don't get back in any other way. So
I think it's also important for people to understand that, like, you also still know Hebrew and not
right.
just Persian. It's like
Yeah.
Jared is the master of languages.
No. That's title goes to my wife. That's not me in any shape or form. Yeah.
That is another thing that I really think is amazing about you, Jared, is how much you honor and respect your wife. She, I know, is your whole world, which just makes me respect you even more.
That's nice. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess I have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
What do you feel like is the best way for a person to like engage with Bible Hub and deep dive into these things?
I actually teach my students there's just really 3 buttons you need to know on Bible Hub. And those 3 buttons are going to change your world. And I get it. It's not the only thing you should be doing, but I think for anyone just starting to dive into this, these are the 3 buttons you need to know. So you go to BibleHub.com and you immediately click on the Hebrew button. That's going to give you the Hebrew interlinear connection between here's the English, here's the Hebrew, and that's perfect. So that's button number 1. Click on the Hebrew, read the actual Hebrew words that are there. Okay. Next, when you find a Hebrew word that looks a little weird, like for example, let's do, you go into Genesis 1 and you go, what is this Elohim we're talking about? So you click on the word Elohim. The next button you want to click is the NASB. The NASB is a short way of saying it for people is just, this is our scholarly consensus, right? This is what the Hebrew is. Hebrew scholars are all agreeing. This is what the word means. Okay, that's button number 2. Button number 3 is the lexicon button, right? And so when you click on that Elohim and you click on the lexicon button, you go to the very bottom of that giant lexicon page, because it's going to give you the full lexicon. It's going to give you, here's the Brown Drivers Briggs, here's the concordance, here's Strong's concordance, here's, and here's some other cool texts and the contemporary notions of the time. But if you go to the very, very bottom of that, you're going to get just the familiar lexicon narrative, right? And that right there is a summation of what the Hallet is going to show you for that lexicon of the time. That's where you find some really great discoveries, right? Because we have a problem with Hebrew, and I have my own beef with mainstream Hebrew scholars I typically poke fun and jab at most Hebrew scholars because they are limited in their research field. Classical Hebrew is great, but classical Hebrew is nothing like the original Proto-Hebrew, right? Proto-Hebrew is a completely different language than classical Hebrew. So every classical Hebrew scholar is going to give you, this is where the classical Hebrew begins. Well, that's not where the scriptures began, my friend. So the scriptures began prior to that classical Hebrew interpretation. And what is that classical Hebrew going to tell you? Monotheism, monotheism, monotheism. This is after they became a monotheistic religion. Okay. You want to, especially as a Latter-day Saint, you want to go back to when it was an oral tradition. You want to understand what they were talking about. And so this is where you find these incredible truths, is in that age of the first temple, where they still believed in the mother, the father, and their son. They still believed in the relationship that makes God. And that's what you're looking for. So, yeah, if you just had those three buttons down, you're going to find incredible truths as you're studying.
Yeah. I always tell my friends, like, I don't read my scriptures anymore. I study them. I don't. I take one word and I go in to Bible Hub and I just look at that word and I find all the connections and I see what is the common theme happening with this word over and over and over again. And I love taking words that are specifically connected to the divine feminine. And oh my gosh, your mind will be blown. You will just start seeing things that you've never seen before. And we really need people to start doing this work because the Old Testament really has so many layers of beautiful concepts and understanding of the divine feminine. But because, we go through our seminary program, we're not taught to see that. We're not even taught to see like the very explicit times that in the scriptures, God is personified as a woman when
I,
there are a lot of scriptures that actually personify God as a woman, but we don't
yeah.
memorize those in seminary.
And we should. If there's any religion that should be doing it, it should be Latter-day Saints.
It
It's so
should.
funny because we need to understand that this is the pattern God always uses, right? Just you can look in our dispensation. God tells Joseph to build temple. Joseph's like, "What is a temple? I don't know what's going on." And he's trying to express this very ineffable revelation that is the endowment, right? He saw the word we use the endowment as like a certain part of the temple now, but the endowment is the whole revelation that is the temple in Joseph's day. And so you see Joseph struggle and trying to get that message out. And so he uses a vehicle for the time, right? He uses the ritual drama of Freemasonry to then use that vehicle to teach these truths, right? Well, that's not a new pattern. That's exactly what happens in every single dispensation, right? And especially when you look at Genesis 1, when they're bringing in the narrative of Adam and Eve and the creation narrative, they're pulling from all the traditions of the area, the local, like A&E, the ancient Near Eastern traditions that surround it, because Genesis 1, 2 is the clearest example of that, right? When we're talking about using Bible Hub on that, just go click, like you, as when you're reading it in English, you're very confused. You're like, okay, so the earth is being formed together and by God. And which God is this? Well, it's Adonai, it's the Lord. Okay, so the Lord is forming the earth together. This isn't new to Latter Saints. We hear this all the time. He's forming this earth together that is now, it says the word is decimated and spread out, scattered. So why is the world decimated and scattered? Well, because they're picking up a narrative from the Enuma Elish just prior to this, right? Everyone knows the creation narrative at the time is the Enuma Elish. That is the contemporary text. And in that story, the mother is sacrificed. She is scattered and demolished. She is destroyed and ruined. And on her body is formed the earth, and she is Mother Earth, right? This is where the notion of Mother Earth comes from. They say you literally are being birthed in the womb of the mother, right? You're being grown in the womb of the mother, and that is the earth. Well, Genesis 1 2 is pulling the very cognates of that text. The tehom, word there for deep, is being pulled directly from the Tiamat, or the word for the mother in the Numa Elish, and they are teaching it off of that narrative. So they are using that creation narrative to then continue this and teach higher, newer truths, right? Because in that narrative, the mother is evil, the mother is bad. She didn't start evil in that tradition. She started as a loving God, and they made her evil. This is what we do, right? We're sexists. We love to destroy women. We love to subjugate them. We love to make them the bad guys because complexity is too complex. We need to simplify it into moral binaries, good and bad. Men are good, women are bad. And this is what we do, right? This is just the pattern of history. And so you can literally see Genesis 1 2, in which it is picking up that narrative and now rewriting it. Now the new narrative is the mother is good, the mother is loving. You were wrong about this. Let me fix this for you. The mother loves you. The mother is there. She's guiding, directing, and with you. You are in the womb of the mother that is this earth. Now, it's these beautiful notions. Now, is it literal? I don't know. The point is you have to decide for yourself. Where do you draw that line?
Yeah. Something I find fascinating about when you start taking a bigger picture of humankind from the very beginning, and you start going through all the different nations, looking at all these different stories, you see how we rewrite the story to our current understanding. And how that isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, that is what the Bible is. It is a rewrite of what was coming before the Bible was written. And they did their best to work with God to restore what they thought was probably true and to receive revelation. But, we have to take into account the greatest gift that God has given us is agency. And God is not going to violate that agency, and is also not going to violate our understanding of the world. And if we hold on to this understanding of the world so tightly that we're not able to actually conceive what was really happening or what is really truly godly,
Yeah.
then God is not going to violate that understanding. They really want us to come to this on our own. They want us to use our agency to become like them
Right,
and
exactly.
to understand like them.
Yeah, I think it's so funny. I mean, the number one thing that I make my classes recognize first and foremost is God is the accommodating God. And I've stolen this phrase from the amazing and great Ben Spackman. Um, the great linguist in our church, and because it's the best way of describing the process of God. And we fail to see this. We preach free agency. We're told in the scriptures is the greatest gift of God. We don't seem to put that into practical play in the narrations and paradigms that we put in our life. You can't have free agency and also have a puppet master God, right? This God who's going, whoa, whoa, whoa. You don't get to say, hey, you're going to go down to this world and you're going to learn from the choices that you make, but I'm giving you a prophet, and that prophet is going to tell you every single thing that you need to do, and you only have to listen to him. No, 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 no. Prophets are stewards, right? But they are people. And my favorite joke from my old bishop is, Catholics are told that everything the Pope says is the literal word of God, that his words are God like incarnate, right? That everything he says is perfection. And there is not a single Catholic that believes that. Mormons are told that their God is, or sorry, their God, their prophet is human and can make mistakes, and yet not a single Mormon believes that, right? And so we have this this polemic issue in our church where we hold everything a prophet says up. This prophet's a BYU fan, so I guess I'm a BYU fan. Like we take it to a weird level where in reality, yes, the prophet is this incredible steward. Yes, the prophet is giving us a divine direction. But no, the prophet can make mistake. No, the prophet can say things according to the lens that he has, right? And so that is that. And we have example after example after example. I mean, just nonstop examples of this. We already talked about two, right? This notion of Sheol, where the first 1,000-year prophets, they don't have the correct revelation on the afterlife. It needs to be fixed later. We have our modern understanding of constant mistakes from our prophets, right? We know that blacks in the priesthood was not a prophetic revelation. It's not that God ever came down and said, hey, Brigham, let's make sure that these blacks never get into the celestial kingdom. That never happened. As much as Brigham touted this doctrine as doctrine, by the way, that is a lie, right? That is just a fallible person. It doesn't mean that Brigham's a bad guy. It doesn't mean that he's a false prophet. What it means is he's a human being. He makes mistakes. It's okay that you have a prophet that was super racist. That's okay. There's a lot of racist people at the time. It's not good that he's racist, and it's not okay to then believe in those racist notions. I had a person reach out to me yesterday online and say, hey, I can prove to you you're wrong. Here's a statement from the first presidency in 1909. And I just laughed because I just wrote him back and I said, look, I'm sorry. Let me emphasize to you, that was a statement from the first presidency in 1909. They had no idea anything about this notion in 1909. Now, here is the current statement from the first presidency on the church website today, which is completely contradictory this statement from 1909. Right. And so this is our problem. Our problem is you need to delineate what is a prophet saying that is prophecy, right? What does the prophet actually say? Is the prophet saying, God told me this? And this is the revelation from God. And even then, you have to understand it's composited. What that means is so I'm writing a paper that's coming out soon. It's the 9 types of revelation in scriptures. Okay. And it shows how very rarely do prophets ever get revelation that's like just pure word of God. It's not like every now and then you'll get a few revelations that are like, and this is what God said. And then it's a script, right? That's very, very rare. Majority of revelation is some other type. It's like visual, or it's a feeling, or it's a notion, or it's, and you go through all these different versions. But no matter what, it's composited, meaning it comes through the paradigm of that prophet and then given to the people according to that paradigm. And so you have to be able to decipher that. If you can't, then I'm sorry. We are not kingsmen, right? We are not kingsmen who simply mindlessly drone on and don't think. No, no, no. We are freemen. We are taught to be freemen, and we only are accountable to ourselves, right? And so we have to learn how to stop being the kingsmen and start being freemen and start judging for ourselves.
And it's not to say that any stage of your spiritual development is bad. Sometimes that stage of being, the kingsman is an
Yeah.
important stage. And just like the scriptures say, line upon line, precept upon precept, like you will grow in faith and in understanding. And that is the whole point of this. But to just get stuck somewhere where we're just going to take everyone's word for it, or we're going to read maybe the Old Testament and take the words and say, this is literal. I need to apply this in my life. I need to.
Yeah. Yeah, we get in trouble for sure.
Yeah. But if you read it with the Spirit and asking for revelation and truly seeking to want to become more like God, then you're going to see right through the text. You're going to see right through what is incorrect. And I just think maybe that is the first step before you really are going in to
Right.
study anything. Is the first step is to come to a place where you actually are ready to surrender all your understandings and
Yeah.
say, I want to start from square one. I want to be taught
Yeah.
truth. Let's do this. I'm ready to deconstruct all my truth towers, all the things that
Yeah.
I have been holding on to as truth. And I'm ready to surrender to God and let God's will be my will, just like
Yeah.
Christ said.
And that's it. That's it. See, that is the humility it's talking about in scripture that you need. You need to approach with this understanding that revelation is line upon line, precept upon precept, that it is ever changing, that God doesn't stop speaking, that it is still coming. But that doesn't mean that the answers aren't there. That doesn't mean that you have to sit back and wait for it to be spoon fed into your little mouth, because no, it's there if you want to dig for it. Right? God will speak to you just as much, right? Joseph, as Fiona Given says, Joseph is the Henry Ford of prophets. He expects every single, just like Henry Ford expected everyone to have a Model T in the garage, Joseph expected every person in the world to have his same revelations, right? It is for us to have as well that same truth that he received. And when you do, when you take it from the source, that is the beautiful process. That is what is so edifying above all else.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, Jared, let's go ahead and wrap up. Why don't you tell
Yeah.
people how they can follow you, how they can get connected to you, how they can enroll in your class if they so desire?
Yeah, absolutely. So I run the Veil Roots project. It's veilroots.com. We just started, so all we have going on is our classes right now, but we have big plans for everything and getting a better way of studying our scriptures out there for everyone, right? Studying your scriptures diachronically. I'm studying it from a historical linguistic perspective, so you get a better picture of what it is. You can follow me online. I'm on Instagram. It's J. Richard Lambert is my name, and Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. I think I have a Facebook account now too. And yeah, so
All the
I'm there.
things. Awesome.
Yeah,
Well, Jared, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. It's been such a pleasure. I really appreciate your time.
absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It's always fun to talk to you, Meg.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode. For more of this content and community, go to patreon.com/inherimagepodcast. We hope you'll tune in next time and find wisdom all along your way.